Hello, I'm Marcin and you're watching World Talks. EU-China summit in Beijing brought no breakthrough in strained bilateral relations. Moreover, despite Ursula von der Leyen describing her meeting with Xi Jinping as excellent, the summit was cut short by half. And to discuss it, we're joined by Marcin Przychodniak, China analyst from the Polish Institute of Foreign Affairs. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. So the summit has been conveyed to celebrate the 50th anniversary of EU-China relations. 50 years, that's a long period. But how would you rate these relations today?
I guess it's probably the most difficult period now in terms of what both sides are would like to achieve, in a sense that interests of both sides are quite contrary to what they actually want and in what kind of position in terms of international relations they are. So, and the summit kind of exemplified the situation when you have completely different interests on both sides, but also you have China and the EU interlinked together. That it's in a sense that it's quite at least very hard, if not impossible, to break down these linkages. And as I said, in the same time, very different interests opposing each other. So
could you tell us more? Could you tell us a little more about these contradictory interests of the EU and China?
Well, no, you have China, which is actually strengthening a strategic relationship with the most imminent threat to European security, which is Russia, of course, which makes China also an enabler for Russia in conducting Russian activities, war, aggression on Ukraine, but also some destabilization efforts in Europe. So that's a first, and that's actually the most important, I believe. Also from the perspective of the European Union, the interests when you have China, in order to remodel the international relations, joins its policies and supports Russia. So that's one. And a second, I think it's everything which can be broadly described as an economic relationship, which in a summary, it's China's policies that undermine European market, in a sense, conditions for European companies, and due to different reasons. I mean, not all of these reasons are completely Chinese fault, but in total, this is a policy with Chinese overcapacity, with Chinese unfair practice, and also Chinese technological advantages makes the situation of European economy in a worse condition. I mean, worsens it and makes it much difficult to sustain, not to mention to develop. So these are probably the two most important and two most contradictory interests that China has and China fulfills, and on the other hand, the EU needs somehow to stop. But also, I mentioned linkages, and this is quite not a tragedy, but a dilemma from the perspective of the European Union, because in some globalized world, interlinked world, and so many years of cooperation, the EU is very much dependent on different types of products being imported from China. Well, first of all, of course, critical raw materials. And China is willing to use this linkages to actually coerce and influence politically the decision-making processes and the position of different member states. So I don't think we have enough time to actually describe this in a specific details, but these are the two main, I think, issues which which caused the summit quite an exchange of monologues rather than a real dialogue, bringing us to some solutions.
I'm also wondering whether this summit was sort of a last chance summit, because the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stated on Thursday in Beijing that, quote, EU-China relations have reached an inflection point. Now, does this mean that they can only worsen now?
Yeah, I guess this is the reality right now. Yeah, I mean, it can worsen because of all these issues I mentioned before. I mean, we are right now in a stage where both sides kind of define each other's interests, as I said, as opposite to each other, as contrary to each other, and so I don't really think, even if we would like to reach a compromise, even if the EU would like to strengthen the relationship with China, to try to do it business as usual as it was like before COVID or before the Russian aggression on Ukraine supported by China in 2022. I don't think it's quite possible from the perspective of the European Union, as was mentioned by President von der Leyen today, but also the G7 summit a month ago, I believe, and in many statements before. The only thing here is that we need a unity, at least some kind of unity within the European Union, and that is what China is trying to influence with different positions of different member states. And the other
precisely, China is obviously trying to exploit it. Now, Hungary tries to become the main window for China's experts in Ukraine, and they have already openly stated that the EU should not meddle in the affairs with China because the business is growing, it's flourishing.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Hungary is the obvious example, but there is also not a clear position of Germany. Very strange from my perspective, but interesting from the position of Spain, for example. So different countries, different interests, and this is definitely China is exploiting. But there's also another issue here, which is very much interesting from Chinese perspective, is of course the US and the transatlantic dilemma here, or the relationship, where of course US is the natural partner for the EU, but considering the recent differences between the US and the EU in trade, but also security, China is also trying to exploit it, and it was quite visible when Minister Wang Yi visited Brussels a couple of weeks ago in preparing for the summit, but also it was a bit visible during the summit in a statement by Xi Jinping himself, when he said that as usual, he underlined again how EU needs to find out its independent. I'm not quoting, I'm paraphrasing, but in a sense that EU needs to find out its own way in international relations, and that it's capable of doing it in the sense that should not follow the US in US's policy towards China, even though Chinese are feeling right now quite confident in face of the EU when China believes that it managed to convince US at least to start the negotiations on trade issues. They are ongoing. There are certain gestures from the Americans that are defined by the Chinese as their success, in a sense. And on the other hand, we have EU, which is in the negotiation process with the US, but there are new announcements by President Trump that he would like to impose new tariffs beginning of August. So seems for the Chinese that they are on a better position right now in terms of this triangle of EU, China, and the US.
Right. So we have already established that the EU is trying to somehow maneuver between China and the US amongst these geopolitical tensions. Well, it hides itself between a rock and a hard place. Now, I'd like to quote Xi Jinping. Decoupling and breaking chains will only result in isolation. It is hoped that the European side will keep the trade and investment market open and refrain from using restrictive economic and trade tools, something you have referred to only a minute ago. Now, I'm wondering, what measures can Europe introduce to balance its trade deficit with China and not to anger Beijing too much?
Well, I don't think these measures are actually to balance the trade, because if we would like to balance the trade, you actually need to open the Chinese market more, and that's of course one of the arguments, and was presented by the EU today at the summit, that Chinese are blocking their market from the access of certain products, also like Polish food. Agriculture and all these kind of issues, but the measures that are there and they're being used by the EU and especially Commission is, for example, the international procurement instrument, which has been used for the first time. There was a decision quite recently to block the Chinese producers of medical equipment from starting in public procurement processes in the EU. And there is also a foreign subsidies regulation, an instrument which is quite strong in terms of European Commission, in the hands of European Commission, because first of all, it does not require a voting between member states, so it's easier to reach a kind of a approval, or the Commission doesn't really need to have an approval to start an investigation. And first, it gives actually, we don't have time to go into details, but in reality, it gives the Commission the ability to actually, because of the subsidies that China provides to most of its investments and activities, economic activities abroad, so it gives Commission ability to actually investigate any kind of Chinese presence, economic presence in the EU, and investigate, and then to sanction it, or to punish it because of the breaking the subsidies regulations and this kind of treatment. So there are instruments, and that is also that's one of the reasons why the Chinese are kind of signaling their positive approach. They are not doing a lot. It's mostly symbolic gestures, but they are very much positive in their narratives towards the European Union. And as we mentioned before, they are trying to influence member states in order to stop or at least reduce the Commission from using these instruments.
There are also gestures from the European side. Human rights violations were not on the agenda during the summit in Beijing.
But they were mentioned in a press release, in a statement.
Yes, but they were not widely discussed.
True.
Not to anger the Chinese partner. Marcin Przychodniak, China analyst from the Polish Institute of Foreign Affairs, was our guest this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching, and stay with us for much more here on TVP World.